speakers from different backgrounds. The first one is Minister Ben Musa. You all know he is not only an excellent academic, but also from different backgrounds. An excellent minister, and we were this morning with him is visiting all the efforts that is being done to accelerate the reconstruction. The work is excellently done. I would like to congratulate you and the team of the Ministry of Education. I was impressed to see after 4 weeks that things are working and working well. But we are inviting you because also you were the one who put together, based on the decision of His Highness Le Roi Mohammed VI, a committee to think the future. And it was an inclusive, and also it was a deep exercise. We will get a bit your views on that. The second speaker comes from Europe, from a country who has done a lot in terms of reforms. 3 decades of transformation put Poland to be in the league of European countries in terms of performance and success. And excuse the pronunciation of the name, Your Excellency, Minister Reszkowska, Minister of Finance, and we will listen to the experience of Poland. The third speaker is a thought provoker. Professor Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard University is someone who is not only teaching, researching, advising, but also thinking. And he focuses on issues from structural reforms to growth to many other issues. Therefore, our first round of discussion will be around a bit setting the stage. And I will start with you, Minister. You have been entrusted of the design of le nouveau modèle de développement. Vous avez mobilisé.
You have mobilized a team quite diversified, and you have made an effort that on the eve of COVID-19, and there was also a political transformation during that period. How could you describe your experience at the moment when His Majesty entrusted you with this most important mission? How did you succeed or manage to bring together divergent views? Could you please give us your feelings and tell us about your experience so that we may project ourselves in the future? Microphone, s'il vous plaît. Microphone, please.
Moi-même et les membres de la commission étions honorés.
Sorry, we still have a little technical issue.
Je voudrais dire combien les membres de la commission.
I'd like to say that the members of the Commission and myself, we were honored by this mission given by His Majesty the King, but we were quite conscious about the challenges we had, because the order was not only to come up with a reform program, the request was to come up with a development model that would be a social project and see how we could implement it concretely, starting from an observation that we've made. The observation was that the growth rate was mild, 3% per year, whereas there is a great potential. And Morocco was going through difficulties in terms of social inequalities and territorial inequalities. So the process that has led to this project we wanted this project to be resilient, and in order to do so, it needed to be co-built with all the living counterparts and players of the country. And we have met with all the political players at that time, with the opposition too. We have met with the economic leaders, with the unions, with the chambers of trade, and many other civil society players. We have been there in the field, across the country, in remote areas, in great cities, to listen to everyone and to collect, to listen to all the expectations that were being expressed. We also knew that if we wanted a resilient project, we needed to start from what we were, our reality, our identity, our institutions, and our strengths. That's how we could move forward. We were also quite aware of the fact that a resilient model does not only mean working on, let's say, economic and social dimensions, but it required a holistic effort. And that's how, in this report, we came up first with an ambition by 2050, with a prosperous Morocco, democratic Morocco, that provides well-being to the citizens. And this ambition was expressed, reflected in different axes, by the creation of value, by economic development, but not only. We also thought in terms of upgrading skills and competences, by increasing solidarity and inclusion, but also thinking about the territories, the sustainable development of the various territories of the country. And again, we have thought about other challenges we should think about in the future. So by 2035, we have thought about indicators that would reflect not only growth, but so many other related dimensions that I have just mentioned. What is important in this process is the how. Because Morocco has got lots of previous reports that would provide room for reforms, and often the difficulty was the actual implementation. And this is where the Commission and its efforts was to provide complementarity between the state that bears the mission, the state that provides this upgrading of skills and competences, but also a society that frees energy, where you can help better making of decisions. We were quite conscious that this complementary effort, just as what happened after the earthquake, where the action of the state was clear, robust under the leadership of His Majesty, but there were also lots of solidarity actions made by so many players. And this has brought about the change and transformation. So we think that transformation is at the core of this new process, of this complementarity. And we have focused on a series of action principles that we think are key if we want to succeed, such as the impact on the citizen, on the human development, a new approach using the collective value, an approach that is sustainable, that is able to upgrade again the capabilities of all players. And this can only be successful if it is enshrined in a framework of trust between players, with the strengthening of governance-related measures. So recommendations were made. This project can only be implemented thanks to the action and efforts of various players. You have the traditional players, the public sector, the private sector, obviously, but also PPPs, but not only. The third sector also, foundations, associations, businesses, they can all bring about value in terms of common well-being. They can participate in this building of trust in the future. So this development model, this ambition, is the how we are going to do things, but it is also about reforms, about recommendations on strategic policies, but also mechanisms that are going to support the management of change. And this is the model that is going to be the natural reference, the standard for the government, but also for political players, without it being a very detailed program, because of course there is a democratic process in the country, so we have to take this into account.
Questions that I will follow up with you. Thank you very much. Especially on the enablers and how we, in this exercise, we can assess where the weaknesses are. But let me go and compare another experience, which is one of the most successful, I may say, in the last 3 decades in Europe. Poland did, over the 3 decades, a series of reforms. Mr. Minister, what are the main lessons that you think one can draw from the case of Poland, where if you are consulted by another colleague, what would you say are the things to do and also the things not to do or to avoid doing?
Thank you very much for inviting me here, and let me take the occasion and congratulate Morocco on the excellent organization of this really very, very important event. And I feel sorry about the recent earthquake, and I hope for those, for the strength and the resilience of those affected. And thank you for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to talk a bit about Poland and about the history, which of course has an impact for the future and for the growth of the country. Poland is in a transformation for over 30 years, and this process was of course full of ups and downs and reform fatigues and also unexpected obstacles. But it is very important to say that over 30 years ago, Poland was a poor and peripheral country in the Eastern Europe. And after 30 years, it has become one of the examples of the world's growth champion and success of global success, one of the success stories for the global economy. And surprisingly, this was due to the communist social egalitarianism that allowed for building democracy, for building inclusive society, and for building prosperous country. Because, in my opinion, the inclusive societies, this is the key for the growth. And at the end of the communism, in 1989, Poland was really in a dreadful situation. It was a bankrupt country with the burdened industry, inefficient, economically destructive, and with hyperinflation. And after 30 years, a global growth champion. And from 1992, with constant growth. Even in the global crisis, 2008, 2009, we were the only country in the European Union to avoid recession. So this is really a success story. And how was it possible, and what are the main lessons? So first of all, I think very important is to have the political will and the elites which know where they are going, what are the goals, despite the fact that the decisions which are taken at the moment, they will have their effects, positive effects in the longer term. We might say that someone sow and someone else reaps the political benefits. And sometimes you need to pay a price, a political price, but you need to see the goal and the gain for the society, the gain for the economy, and the gain for the state. The second lesson is that really deep market reforms were necessary, and they were introduced in Poland. Of course, we could do better because there were some difficult points in those reforms, but these reforms, they put foundations to the future growth. The third one, it is the mix of policies. You need to have the proper mix of economic policy, of development policy, focused on accumulation and proper allocation of capital. And the next thing is institutions, and institutions, they really matter. You need strong institutions like democracy, you need free market, you need open economy, you need open free competition. This all really matters, and this needs to be supported by the culture, by the proper culture. But in the case of, I think, every reform, what is really, really important is that you need to have an anchor for the reform. And in case of Poland and of our reforms from the 90s and 2000s, it was the EU accession. We saw the goal of being a part of the European Union, and World Banks put it once that European Union is a convergence machine, that it takes poor countries and makes them rich. And without the EU perspective, without the EU reforms for Poland, it would be much more difficult to build strong institutions and to change culture. And this was the return to Europe. This was a really strong motivator for the politicians, for the elites, but also for the society to survive, to understand the reforms. Sometimes it was very hard, but the motivator, the strong motivation was there. So this is really the main lessons learned, and I think what you need the egalitarian, inclusive society, you need strong institutions, you need strong policymakers, you need anchor for the reform, but you also need a lot of luck. And don't forget, this is very, very important, don't forget about the most vulnerables, because the growth needs to be inclusive. And reforms, you need, in frame of the reform, you need to have the prevention mechanisms developed, not to be too deep, not to sacrifice the most vulnerable ones.
Thank you very much. Again, I have certain
مرة أخرى
how an anchor like accessing Europe was easy to convey to the population, and the political economy of such transformation in a cycle that with democracy becomes very short. But I'll come back to that. Let me maybe now move to Professor Hausman. Ricardo, you have worked in different geographies from Latin America to Middle East, Asia, and you have written, taught about those issues for decades. Now you are here in Morocco at those annual meetings where many issues have successively affected us over the last few years. What you would say about succeeding in big transformative reforms?
Well, first of all, Jihad, thank you very much for this invitation, and thanks to Roberto Cardarelli for writing this book and for also including me. This is a great honor to be back in Morocco. I was here some 15 years ago, and I was able to see many of these bets, c'est Paris, that were just bets at the time, to see them materialize. Tanger Med, the aerospace, the car industry, the tourism plans, and so on. So I'm super happy to be back and to reflect on lessons for the world from Morocco that I think some of them are in the book, some of them are not sufficiently emphasized in the book. So I'm going to try to extract some lessons for the world from this. But let me start by saying that the world is quite frustrated with this issue of growth, because we thought we knew the secret. The secret is that we had to improve health, We had to have families with fewer children so we could invest more in the education of the children. So with fewer children, more educated, in school, women would have more of a chance to participate in the economy, so higher female labor force participation in more urbanized settings. And so this combination of education, health, demographic transition, urbanization was going to facilitate the absorption of technology, growth, and so on. Well, guess what? Since 1990, 90% of the countries have narrowed significantly the life expectancy gaps, say with the US or the advanced world. 90+% of countries have narrowed the education gap. 90% of countries have narrowed the urbanization gap. 80% of countries have narrowed the female labor force participation gap. But only 40-some% of countries have narrowed the income gap. The medium country has not narrowed the income gap, in spite of narrowing dramatically all these other gaps. So this poses a question, how come? How come we do all these major transformations and we don't get to narrow the income gap? That's in part, let me say, because technological gaps have been widening in the majority of countries. You would say, how could technological gaps be widening if education gaps are narrowing? So I've been thinking a lot about these things, and I want to say that all these things that people mention, macro stability, structural reforms, health, education, etc., female labor force participation, they're all in principle good. Some of them are intrinsically good, but they may not necessarily constitute a growth strategy. And to explain that, I want to make the following distinction. I think that all of these good things are complements. They are not substitutes. Complements are things like coffee and sugar. Substitutes are things like coffee and tea. Well, if you like to drink your coffee sweet, you're going to either run out of coffee or you're going to run out of sugar. If things were substitutes, you run out of coffee no matter you drink tea. But if they're complements, you tend to run out of some before you run out of others. And the one you run out of first becomes your binding constraint. And if you don't have coffee, giving more sugar is not going to solve the problem. So these different areas of policy are complements. And because of that, you run out of some before you run out of others. As a consequence, this has very important implications for what constitutes a growth strategy. I think in Latin America, my own country, Venezuela, and Argentina are scientific proof that bad macro can destroy a country. But I think that Chile and Peru constitute scientific proof that good macro is not a growth strategy, that you can have the good macro and not grow, not narrow gaps. So I would say, if macro is not your binding constraint, more macro is like giving more sugar when you don't have coffee. I would say the same thing about education. Education, I'm in the education business, so I'm not going to talk evil about education, but the question is education the binding constraint? Maybe not. Maybe you will educate more people, but if the economy is not solving other problems that can absorb people, your educated people might leave, they might be driving Uber, and you may not be extracting the full value of their education. And that, I would say, is the typical performance of most countries in the world right now. They've narrowed dramatically their education gaps, but they have not narrowed their income gaps. I would say the same thing about health. I would say the same thing about female labor force participation. They are not silver bullets. They will have a big impact on growth if they are the binding constraint. If they're not the binding constraint, they may not have the impact you're hoping. So you cannot add, add some improvement in health, to some improvement in education, to some improvement there, and you add them all up and say this is how much the economy will be growing. They don't add up that way. If you move the binding constraint, you'll see action. So as a consequence, I would say another fact. Some people say, do we want export-led growth? Do we not want export-led growth? What alternatives are there to export-led growth? In the studies I've done, let me put it very bluntly, all sustained exports, all sustained growth are export-led. There is no such thing as non-export-led growth, in the sense that on average, when a country grows at 1, exports grow at 1.4. Sustained growth, you have exports growing faster than GDP. So all exports is always, all growth is always export-led. Sustained growth is always export-led, and not just export-led, it's export-led in a transformation of your export package towards greater diversity and towards more complexity in the things you export. In the study I've done, essentially, 40% of countries narrowed their income gap. Only 20% of countries narrowed the gap significantly. Morocco narrowed the gap. It was 10% of US GDP in 1990. It's now 13% of US GDP. Still, the gap is huge, right? But sort of narrowing. It's in the second quintile of growth experiences in this period, Morocco, okay? Those countries transformed their export basket. They diversified towards more complex products. That is central to a growth strategy. But diversification is full of market failures because it faces a bunch of chicken and egg problems. If you're going to diversify, it means that we're going to start making things you were not making before. But to make things, you have to know how to make them. But you typically don't know how to make the things you don't do. So how do you start making the things you don't do if to make them you have to know how to make them, but you don't know how to make the things you don't do? You need watches, you need watchmakers to make watches, but why are you going to have watchmakers in a country that doesn't make watches? And how do you become a watchmaker if the country is not making watches? So how do you diversify? These things markets are not good at, and just freeing markets is not going to be enough. You will have to have something that I noticed was not mentioned, I would say, at all in the book, and that is that you need industrial policies. You need sector policies. It was even in the video. It was even in the video that you need tourism policy, you need agricultural policy, you need, you need aerospace policy, you need policies to, you need séparer, these bets to facilitate the transformation process. And that's why we see in the Moroccan export basket the growth of tourism in new areas, in new destinations, the whole industrial structure that developed around Tanger Med. You see the movement towards new things. For example, right now, the world is sending the message that there is global warming, climate change, and that every country should focus on how they're going to lower their own emissions, right? That's a conversation, and we will help you lower your own emissions. But if you are in a country like Morocco that has so much sun and so much wind, why should the focus be on helping Morocco lower its emissions? The ambition is, what can Morocco do to help the world lower its emissions? The world is currently emitting a lot because the world is using ammonia as fertilizer, and that ammonia is gray and emits a lot of CO2. So if the world is going to lower its emissions, the world is going to need green ammonia, and OCP is going to provide them with a green ammonia so that the world lower its emissions, not Morocco. If Morocco stops its emissions, the world is not going to notice. But the world is going to notice if Morocco helps them mobilizing its sun and wind resources to help the world lower its emissions. And that, by the way, let me say, is also, I mentioned industrial policy, which is a four-letter word. OCP is a state-owned enterprise, which is also kind of like a four-letter word. If you take an IMF report, it will say, if you search for state-owned enterprise, very, very near, you'll find the word privatization, right? Because it's sort of like, state-owned, private, no. State-owned enterprises can play a strategic role in diversification, and I think that it has played that role in Morocco, and I want to rescue that experience from Morocco to the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ricardo, I have many questions to you, but two observations. The question of industrial policy is something that we are internally reflecting on, seriously, but we are reflecting on it. We're a bit worried that is an issue that could be considered or used as a way to develop policies that will limit trade and be a bit on the protectionism than more on designing the future. My second observation, you are sitting near someone who come from a country where industrial policy destroyed growth in the past. It's very interesting to see what you're saying, and this brings me to my second round of questions, is how you make it happen. And this is an issue where it's not only for good economists or strategists, it's also for those who are going to implement. And this is where we hit the wall of political economy. This is where the big issues, you need to address a situation where you have winners and losers. How you do this? You hit a situation where you have majorities that could be, in fact, losing elections because of those transformative reforms. Again, let me go back to you. How you did in Poland survive 3 decades of reforms without facing those kind of issues. Or maybe you have faced them, but what are the lessons that you have learned from this experience?
Okay, of course, it's not that during the transformation and during the reforms there was a stable political situation. The governments changed many times because, as I said, it is that you need to take sometimes very difficult decisions. Sometimes there is a cost, a political cost, but the main issue was that we saw the ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal was to catch up the West, to become a European Union member, and we had a framework, a very strong framework for the reforms, which was given by the European Commission for the states which were in the accession process and which need to come through transformation, to introduce very strong, very efficient institutional reforms, to fight the corruption, to introduce transparent measures in the administration, to build a culture which was the culture accepted by the European Union and the culture which gave the businesses a very very transparent business environment to grow with their business activities, and so this EU reform, the EU reform anchor, this was really a strong incentive for Poland. Of course, it didn't mean that all the people all the time they were very happy because we were going towards the European Union. At the beginning of the reforms, we had a very deep market reform and also very deep reforms because of the hyperinflation. And we could do more about the vulnerable people in this time, because we a bit and the governments they sacrificed them on the way, and this was the role for the next governments to think about the social programs, to think about those most affected, and about the inclusive growth, to make the growth really inclusive. But the deep market reforms, they had a very important impact on the businesses and on their activities, because we entered a single market, and EU and the single market gives a lot of opportunities. That's one thing. And the free competition, the open market, this allowed for the Polish companies to build really strong businesses. And nowadays we can see the examples of the businesses which started in the 90s, in the early 2000s, which are now the biggest world's exporters, like furniture, like doors and PVC windows. Like the very famous games, The Witcher and Cyberpunk. These are the Polish products and the benchmark, let's say, for Poland. We are also one of the leaders in the spare parts for automotive sector, for the lithium batteries, the first one in Europe. And because we have managed to build a very friendly business environment with a lot of tax incentives supporting the investments, we are also a very attractive country for foreign investors. The FDI grows, the amounts grows every year from like 5% year to year. So Poland has become a hub also for the hubs, a place for the hubs, like for R&D, for innovation, for services in fintech, in ICT. And this is due to the reforms we have carried for those 3 decades, because these were the investments in the infrastructure, in the human development, so the education, the quantity and quality of education was very important, and now we can harvest, let's say, because we have a very, very skilled labor force in Poland. And also in the recent years, the focus on digitalization, on the innovation and support also of the government for those processes. But I think that the big challenge nowadays is the accessibility of the capital, and it is the challenge for the whole Europe. So there is something to be done there, and this is very important also to have strong institutions. I said already about the democracy, open markets, everything, but also the government. The government needs to build a trust with the traders, with the entrepreneurs, but also with citizens. And when you introduce new reforms, you really need to seek for a broader support for the reform and to define the goal clearly and to explain and try to build a coalition around the idea. This is really, a dialogue is very important, but also to create a good environment. And in Poland, it is also, when we are talking about the inclusive growth, about the most vulnerables, you need to have also a social policies. Of course, the sound finances are really a key here to afford to realize your goals and also not to lose the social part. And what we did in Poland was a very successful reform of the tax system. It was the organizational reform, legal reform, but also digitalization, which helped a lot with the ceiling of tax system, but also increasing compliance. And we have doubled or more than doubled our tax incomes in the course of the last seven years. So this is really what is important, to have a clearly defined goal, to be decisive. Of course, it will cost sometimes, a political cost will be there, but you need a mature politicians, but you also need a mature society, and this could be done by education, by the democratic processes, which will help and the strong anchors for your reforms.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Let me now also thank you very much. When thinking about sequencing and implementation, turn to you, Minister. You have identified an important set of reforms. You have delivered in the past, as Ricardo mentioned, the delivery on les paris de l'avenir 15 years ago. Where do you see the sequencing of all these important reforms? This is my first question. And my second related questions, do you see gaps? Have you identified certain number of gaps, especially on the enablers, access to finance, access to talent, access to market? And what have you learned from your experience and experience of others in order to engage in a journey like this? And what is the ideal sequencing of all these reforms?
Je voudrais revenir.
I would like to come back on what Ricardo said about the significance of having a holistic approach whereby reforms are not sequential but are a part of an approach that deals simultaneously with different dimensions. Our conviction at the Commission was that we could not achieve our ambitions if we tackled the subjects in a sequential way. Our conviction was also that some reforms had necessarily more impact. Some reforms were mature to be launched immediately. Others required more exchange and debate before being politically implemented. These were reforms that involve winners and losers, and we need to manage to strike a balance to go forward. We were also aware that the capacity of implementation, which is not necessarily and only financial but also institutional, is a real challenge. Based on this, we identified a certain number of subjects on which we had to work, and we regrouped them in three axes. An axe relating to the economy and creation of value. And when we talk about value creation, I may link this with what was said about the industrial policy, the need today to diversify, to exert more effort in terms of investment, and these investments need to be connected to the objectives that are part of our development model. The need also to improve upon our competitiveness in a world where the carbon component is significant, hence all the work to be done on low price energy and carbon that needs to be implemented as a factor of competitiveness of our economy. And third axis, still related to the economy, we need to pay attention to solidarity and to the social aspect, especially here in Morocco, where we have social realities. We don't have only major businesses. We need to work on employment. And the second major field relates to those human-centered efforts, inclusion of women, of the youth. These subjects need to go hand in hand with the major economic issues and need to mobilize efforts and the energy of players. And finally, a third field that can be summed up in a governance approach, how to mobilize territories and how to create the conditions for this sustainable development in a country like Morocco. This has major significance for the population when we talk about water scarcity, for example. This makes sense because you immediately link this to food security. And so working on these dimensions, the digital realm, reform of justice, all these projects and fields that need to be opened up urgently and simultaneously. And this also leads me to another important point. We need to create a consensus on the objective to be reached, and this would justify all the efforts of reform. For these subjects, we need to create a micro consensus to be able to find the right path to reach these reforms. And this is the situation, for example, in the sector that I have the honor to preside over, the education sector. We conducted many efforts based on a roadmap in consultation with all other players, pupils, parents, and other stakeholders, to refine our change path and make sure that it becomes a reality, while paying attention to the impact and to the way we may mobilize teachers for such exercise. We need, of course, to improve their working conditions, their training, but also their material or financial situation in a structural approach that can be considered more as an investment than a mere increase of an operational budget. A complementary question: how can we steer all this? Do you see it as a centralized effort, state-led or not? Implementing by objectives or through a more detailed formulation? The approach that we prefer is a follow-up mechanism, which is a societal project that involves all actors, the government, the civil society, economic operators. The convergence of all these players is an important subject, and also with assessment stages to see what is working and what is not. And His Majesty the King has entrusted this follow-up mission of the implementation of this reference framework to the High Commissioner for Planning, and the implementation of this structure that is underway has allowed us to create these conditions of convergence geared towards the objective, with a clear implementation capacity. And here I would like to talk about the macroeconomic framework, which is not an and per se, but also a lever and a framework that allows us to accompany and achieve this ambition. Of course, we need to mobilize internal resources, external resources, international resources, and diversify all these resources, and also accept that there can be some imbalances when achieving this transformation towards more growth and more inclusive growth with delivery capacity, proven delivery capacity. And this is also the opportunity to stress the importance of assistance by international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, of high significance to accompany this dynamic and to contribute to the success of such dynamic. Now, the third aspect, which is the role of the private sector, a very important partner indeed, and we will also come back on the industrial policy that Ricardo mentioned earlier. But before we go to this third part, Ricardo, let's talk about the region. You have accompanied several countries in their transformation projects. You have touched very closely different experiences. Some were successes and others not. Are there any elements that differentiate regions when it comes to achieving such a transformation process?
is very hard to achieve anywhere in Middle East, North Africa, and elsewhere in the world, is a cooperative relationship between government and the private sector. There is enormous complementarities between what the private sector can do and what the private sector needs from the government. There are markets for cars, and you can have a market for car and freedom of car, pricing, etc. But no one wants to buy a car if there are no roads, if there are no traffic signs, if there are no traffic lights, if there are no traffic rules, if there are no traffic cops. Every industry lives in a space of public goods. Now it's very hard to sell an electric vehicle because people wonder, if I run out of battery, where am I going to charge the car? And nobody wants to put charging stations because nobody owns an electric car. So you have these chicken and egg problems everywhere, and you have to have a framework where there is enough communication between a private sector that sees opportunities, a private sector that suffers obstacles, and a government that is able to adopt, adjust its policies, its infrastructure, its rules to facilitate the exploitation of those opportunities. And that's very hard to achieve. There's, in some countries, there's big distrust of the private sector. There are some parts of government that want to keep control of parts of the economy. In other parts, there's just inability to put society to deal with its issues. You come from Lebanon. We understand that it's been 4 years, an inability to address a major crisis to get yourself together. So I would emphasize the fact that Morocco has a vision